scriptures. In fact, I know that just recently you did a series on the book of Exodus, and when God describes himself, it's interesting in Exodus 34 how he describes the various attributes that he has. Listen to what it says. The Lord, the compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness, maintaining love to thousands, and forgiving wickedness, rebellion, and sin. The very first character trait that God gives of himself is that God is a God who is compassionate. Now, I wonder if that's the first word that comes to your mind. I think if I was to do a survey of most of us, even in church, and ask you to finish this sentence, the Lord is, we might say the Lord is holy, and we'd be right. The Lord is righteous. The Lord is strong. The Lord is powerful. The Lord is just. All of these things are true. Yet when God describes and discloses himself to Moses, the very first point, he says that he is a compassionate God. But do you believe that? Do you believe that God is compassionate? Do you believe that he is moved by the troubles that you and I experience and that he actually cares? You see, when you're suffering through a bad relationship or perhaps a relationship that's broken and you feel alone, you often ask, does God really care? Or sometimes there can be the challenges of our mental health, and our mental health fails us. And we feel like God is distant. Does he really care? A family member or even ourselves are faced with a cruel medical diagnosis. And we ask, is the God of this universe really interested? Does he care? Well, here in Matthew 14, we're going to come to a passage where we are going to see that not only God cares, but God is deeply compassionate about the world that you and I live in. And so what we're going to do tonight, we're going to ask and answer this question. How does Jesus show his compassionate heart? How does Jesus show his compassionate heart? As we come to this account in the life of Jesus, recorded by Matthew, we want to get a glimpse of what does compassion really look like? Does God really care? And so to answer that question, we're going to do a couple of things. We're going to look at one day. This is an account. All of Matthew 14 takes place in one 24-hour period. We're going to look at one day, but in particular, we're going to look at two miracles. And then out of that, we're also going to see three responses and what this passage reveals about Jesus. Well, just by way of background, when we come to this passage, verse 13 begins, when Jesus heard what happened, he withdrew by boat privately to a solitary place. Hearing of this, the crowds followed him on foot from the towns. Now, if we were to go back just a few verses earlier, we would discover that this account, this demonstration of Jesus' compassion towards the people that he meets, happens in a context where Jesus is in himself an area and an element of grief. You say, when it says here that Jesus heard what had happened, he had just heard that his cousin had been brutally murdered. His cousin, John the Baptist, had died at the hands of this wicked tetrarch, this wicked ruler named Herod. Now, death, I think, impacts us all differently. But if you've ever lost a loved one, somebody close to you, a parent, a sibling, somebody that you know, you'll know the last thing you want to do is actually spend a lot of time with people. You actually don't want to have lots of conversations. You want a bit of distance. You want a bit of time to yourself. But this is the context in which we see the compassion of Jesus. Jesus lost a loved one. He's grieving. He's no doubt shed tears. His heart is heavy. He's thinking perhaps of his cousin. He needs time to process, time to grieve, time to be alone. And it says that he was looking for a solitary place. But because of his reputation, there is no solitary place now for Jesus. And we see that the crowds, when he gets out of the boat, the crowds are there on foot to see him. Look at verse 14 and what Jesus does in this context of need. When Jesus landed and saw a large crowd, he had compassion on them and healed the sick. He has compassion on them. Now, if I was Jesus at this point, I think it's entirely legitimate that Jesus could have got out of the boat, And as people approached him, none of us would have begrudged Jesus to say, you know what? Hey, guys, you don't know this, but I've just lost my cousin. I'm grieving. I'm emotionally spent because of this. Just give me some time. And I think all of us would have thought, no, actually, that's not a bad plan. That is entirely legitimate. Jesus is emotionally worn out, no doubt. And yet what happens? This large crowd comes, but look at Jesus' surprising response. He has compassion on them. Now, the word compassion here, this is not a very common term in our writings of the New Testament. And the idea of compassion, even this particular term as it's used in the Bible language and in the Bible context, it was used of somebody's internal organs. In fact, the term that we get the term spleen from this particular term that's related to compassion. And it's the idea of somebody's inside physically being impacted by this emotion. So when it says here that Jesus has compassion, it's the idea that Jesus sees a crowd and there is something internal within him that feels, even physically, for those around him in need. And we know as we go through, if you've been coming along the series in Matthew's Gospel, this is a consistent passion that Jesus has. You see, Jesus will show compassion to the social outcast. If you remember back in Matthew 9, that's actually the author of this gospel account, Matthew, sometimes referred to as Levi, who's a social outcast. And yet Jesus looks at this guy and welcomes him and invites him to follow him. Jesus is compassionate to those who might have been on the margins. He's compassionate consistently in this account of Jesus' life to the physically impaired, to the blind, to the lame, to the deaf. Jesus has this yearning in his gut that he wants to bless them, that he wants to heal them, that he wants to serve them. He is compassionate to the spiritually troubled. We find several accounts where there's somebody comes and they're demonized and they're unsettled, and Jesus will show compassion to them. We also see that he is compassionate to those who are grieving. Jesus himself, even in this passage, is familiar with death. But elsewhere in the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus goes to other families where they've lost a loved one. And he doesn't dismiss them or say, well, on the resurrection day, it'll all be okay. No, Jesus is compassionate. His guts churn as he shows his concern for others. And it's in this context, Jesus' own struggle, that he comes here in Matthew 14, and it says that he has compassion to the sick. He is aware of the suffering of the people. But more than that, more than just the individuals who are sick, look at what it says in verse 17. As evening approached, the disciples came to him, Jesus, and said, this is a remote place. It's already getting late. Send the crowds away so that they can go to the villages and buy themselves some food. Okay, again, this is fair enough from the disciples. They're saying, listen, Jesus, there's this large crowd who are here, just send them away. Now, we'll know from the context that 5,000 men are numbered. That's usually how they numbered a crowd. There's 5,000 men, but when you add women on top of that and children, people have suggested there's anywhere from 15 to 20,000 people. And so this is no small crowd. This is a large gathering. The disciples say, Jesus, can you just please tell them to go home? It's been a long day. Now, Jesus knows it's been a long day. He's been shedding tears for his cousin. Yet what does Jesus do? Verse 17. We here have only 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish, they answered. Bring them here to me, Jesus said. And he directed the people to sit down on the grass, and taking the 5 loaves, the 2 fish, and looking up to heaven, he gave thanks and broke the loaves. Then he gave them to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the people. They all ate and were satisfied, and the disciples picked up 12 basketfuls of broken pieces that were left over. Now, I don't know if you're an extrovert or an introvert, but even for an extrovert, there's a lot of people here, and that is pretty taxing. And when you've got to start organising a crowd this size and organising a banquet, sit down here, sit down here, sit down here, sit down here, this is emotionally taxing. Yet what we get here in the glimpse of this supernatural miracle, there are hints going back to the Old Testament where God provided manna from heaven for his people. God supernaturally in the past provided sustenance for the people who were there and in need. And in a scene reminiscent of that, Jesus takes these simple elements, these fish and these loaves, and he begins to pass these to his disciples, who pass them to others. And ultimately, not only is the crowd fed, there are 12 basketfuls left. This pictures a great God who is not only giving things, but is giving so generously in provision that all of their needs are met. And so the first thing I observe in this passage is that Jesus shows compassion to those who are in need. Jesus shows compassion to those who are in need. Jesus is not indifferent. Jesus does not say it's somebody else's problem. Jesus does not say the world is going to carry on, I'm just going to sit in the background. Rather, Jesus is compassionate to those before him and those in need. Now, friends, there are going to be times in your life when you feel that God is distant. There are times that we experience where we feel that God maybe is unaware of just how hard life is. This passage reminds me that God is not distant. He knows your needs. In fact, he's the only one who can satisfy fully your needs. This passage reminds me that even when I go through grief and loss, there is a God who I can depend on, who himself knows grief and loss. His guts yearn. He has that compassion for us because he knows how frail we are. He has seen it firsthand. So Jesus shows compassion to those in need. But here's the thing, this day that's been very difficult already for Jesus, he's lost a cousin, he's had some grief there, he's now fed this mass of humanity, and finally we get to this place where we think, okay, the story is going to finish and Jesus' day will well and truly be up. But here we have another a session and another aspect where this compassion is going to be shown even more. Verse 23 said that Jesus goes up to the mountainside to pray, and he gets up there, and here's where the day goes from bad to worse. You see, we discover that the wind starts to pick up. Verse 24, his disciples having been dismissed, the boat was already a considerable distance from the land, buffeted by the waves because the wind was against it. He's told his disciples, go to the other side of the lake, I will see you there. Now, Jesus is confident that they're going to get there. So that should be enough, right, for his promises. Jesus goes away after dismissing the crowd, but then all of a sudden his disciples, his followers on the lake, get caught in this terrible storm. Now, these are fishermen. They've been out on the lake many times. They understand bad weather conditions, but it's terribly, on this particular night, it seems to be terrible conditions. And they are struggling. And then it says that Jesus walks out onto the lake. Now, pause at that point. Sometimes when we think of Jesus walking on water, we almost think that it's like this flat ground of ice, and Jesus sort of, walking, or if you watch those old school movies, gliding, okay? But Jesus is making his way, but that's not the case. Actually, the waves are going up and down. It is a storm here, and Jesus makes his way out. Jesus is fully in control, but he's aware that his disciples are in need. And I might just pause it there, just as a side note. It says that Jesus walked out there on the lake. He didn't run. Jesus was doing things in his own time with his own wisdom. And sometimes when we go through big trials and there's troubles and we're anxious, we want God to run. But sometimes God allows these things because he has a greater purpose. And here in this passage, we see Jesus walking out. And you'll notice what they say in verse 26. When the disciples saw him, Jesus, walking on the lake, they were terrified. It's a ghost, they said, and they cried out in fear. Now, in Bible times, again, the people weren't great swimmers back in the day. And one of the theories that people had was that because there were so many drownings, not only in the Sea of Galilee, but in all bodies of water in the ancient world, they had this belief that so many people drowned that their dead spirits, that the ghosts would sometimes reappear. And evidently the disciples, they're out there and they see this figure walking, maybe bobbing up and down, walking towards them. They've never seen Jesus walk on water before. And so they freak out. It's a ghost. It's a ghost. They cry out in fear. Now, Jesus could have said to them, fellas, it's me. Okay, why are you guys panicking? But notice what he does. Notice the compassion in his response. Jesus immediately said to them, take courage. It is I. Don't be afraid. The most common command probably in Jesus' whole ministry negatively is do not be afraid. Put positively, take heart. This is a consistent theme in Jesus. And here we get a second glimpse of what Jesus is like. And that is Jesus shows compassion to those who are afraid. Jesus shows compassion to those who are afraid. Now, I've got some fears in my life that I've experienced over the years. One of them is I'm quite claustrophobic. So if you put me in the back of an aeroplane in the very last row, in the corner, next to the toilet, it's not going to end well. Okay, I have this fear, and part of that, I'm not sure, I've got a variety of reasons why I might be a bit claustrophobic. But years ago, I was unwell with cancer. And one of the side treatments that I had was I had radiation to my head. And that wasn't pleasant. I had a tumour the size of a golf ball here in my sinus. And they gave me chemo and I had a transplant and some more other things. But one of the things they did, they made a hard mask for me where I'd have to lay down on a table and my head would be bolted to the table. And I had a little ball in my mouth and they did radiation and the hospital staff were excellent. But every time I would lay there with my head on the table, my heart would go like this. My mind would race. This is going to be the end of me. I'm never going to get out of here alive. I'd pray the Psalms. Be merciful to me, oh my God. My enemies pursue me all day long. But in seriousness, I was afraid. I was afraid in that context. And there are going to be times in your life where you go through great times of fear. For some of you, you might have a fear of being in a large crowd. It gets too overwhelming. Other people have the fear that they are going to get old together and have no one and be abandoned. You might have a fear of a medical condition or social rejection. But this passage reminds me that whatever your fears, there is one who, even in the midst of the up and down ways, wants to say to you, take care, take courage, don't be afraid, I am with you. What an encouraging word that Jesus gives them here. Friends, in your life, there are going to be large waves and they might not disappear. But this passage reminds me that Jesus shows compassion to those who are afraid. He doesn't say you're going through a hard time and you're panicking. The best of luck with that. No, we have a God here revealed who is compassionate to those who are afraid. But then thirdly, we see that Jesus also shows compassion to those who are doubting. Jesus shows compassion to those who are doubting. Now, I love the Apostle Peter. He's the guy, I say, he's the apostle with the foot-shaped mouth. Okay, he's always putting his foot in his mouth, this guy. And if you look at verse 28, we get Peter, he immediately sees this, he hears Jesus and his response. Lord, if it's you, Peter replied, tell me to come to you on water. And again, often we can think here that the way that it's nice and flat, but no, it's not nice and flat. It's going up and down. And this is pretty gutsy, to be honest, by Peter. But look at how Jesus responds. Come, he said. Then Peter got down out of the boat, walked on the water, and came toward Jesus. But when he saw the winds, he was afraid and beginning to sink, cried out, Lord, save me. Peter, for all of his faults, showed an element of trust in Jesus. Now, someone has said, even though we see he starts to sink here, somebody has said, it's better to be a wet Peter than a dry Thomas. Okay? At least Peter gets out of the boat. He sees the Lord and he wants to respond to the Lord. So there is something very noble that we see here in the life of Peter where he wants to get out. In fact, it says Peter walks on the water. Only 2 people ever in history have done it. And Jesus is the first one, and they've just seen that happen. And Peter, again, he doesn't normally think through these things. He's like, hey, I'll do it too. And he gets out there, but you'll notice what happens. Immediately, we see he begins to sink. He became afraid. He looks at the waves surrounding him, and the net result is he began to sink. But Jesus doesn't say, Peter, your faith's pretty small. You failed me. Good luck with that. What does Jesus do? Verse 31. Immediately Jesus reached out his hands and caught him. You of little faith, he said, why did you doubt? Even there, Jesus does not abandon Peter, even though his faith is weak, even though he's struggled, even though he's got these doubts. God still reaches out to him and delivers him from his predicament. Friends, we are so often like Peter. We are so often sinking. We are so often frail in our faith. We are so often disobedient. We so often look at our problems and circumstances rather than looking at Jesus. But here's the good news. Jesus doesn't look at us and say, you know what? You've let me down again. You're out. You're off the team. But what does he do regularly? He cries, when we cry out to him, he reminds us of his goodness. He forgives. He delivers. Today you might be here and you might have doubts about God's goodness. You might have hard questions. You might feel that your faith goes up and down like the waves. But I want to tell you tonight there is something good. Your relationship with God is not dependent upon what you do, how good your faith is. Your faith is dependent on the sufficiency of a Saviour who is willing to lift his hand and put his hand down to you and snatch you out of the depths. Isn't it good news that it doesn't depend on us? Isn't it good news that it's not dependent on the ability of your faith? This passage reminds me that Jesus is one who shows compassion even to those who doubt.